Back in November of 2011, my girlfriend, Holly, invited me to Thanksgiving at her parents' place. We'd been seeing each other since February of that year, so it seemed about the right time to meet her folks. But then, when I responded with a very enthusiastic yes, she told me it wouldn't be that kind of visit. It wasn't just going to be us and her parents. She was an only child. A bunch of other family members would be there, including her paternal grandpa and her paternal aunt. Her paternal grandpa was a weird old coot, didn't have a great relationship with her dad, and was always a source of tension during holiday get-togethers. But the reason she was really nervous that year, and the reason why she needed me there as, and these are the words she used, a service animal, was the presence of that paternal aunt, a lady who I'll just simply refer to as Janet. Her dad and grandpa didn't get along, but in the case of Aunt Janet, she and Holly's grandpa hadn't said so much as a word to each other in almost 20 years. To be fair, she hadn't spoken to much of anyone since she left town in her 20s, which was apparently sudden, without explanation, and under dubious circumstances. Starting up around the time Holly's grandma died, she kept in touch with her sisters here and there, but she hadn't been home to visit anyone in almost 2 decades. So to have her suddenly showing up again and showing interest in being around the family, it was a really big deal to Holly's mom and dad. As expected, Holly's grandpa had been dead against the idea of her coming to Thanksgiving dinner, but her dad was insistent. It was the first time Aunt Janet had asked to be around them in nearly 2 decades, so there was no way in hell he was about to turn down this first request, because who knew when they'd get another? Everyone acknowledged it was a potentially volatile situation, but being accustomed to such occurrences at everything from Christmases to 4th of July barbecues, Holly's dad felt the potential rewards were worth the risks. Some of Holly's relatives were optimistic, but it was an optimism she didn't share, and she made it abundantly clear that the event would most likely go horribly wrong, and since that wouldn't be particularly pleasant for me to witness, she said that she wouldn't hold it against me if I turned down the invitation. That was how Holly phrased it, but what I heard was if you put up with my dumb family, then it'll show that you're really serious about this relationship. And since I was getting pretty serious about our future together, it was like she'd thrown me a curveball I had a really good chance of knocking out of the park. Holly's parents lived in a really nice place over in North Jersey. It was a modern colonial with a regal-looking red brick facade and a welcoming porch supported by grand white columns. The front lawn and flower beds were perfectly maintained, and I'm pretty sure I saw a pool, hot tub, and barbecue pit in the backyard, each covered up for the winter. But it was only when I walked inside that I realized just how fancy the place really was. The entranceway consisted of a grand 2-story foyer with sweeping double staircase, gleaming chandelier, and polished hardwood floors. Holly had already told me that her parents made a lot of money, but their house had to be one of the nicest I've ever laid eyes on, and I say that as an avid watcher of those old MTV crib clips. There was a formal living room and dining room, both with coffered ceilings and oversized windows for this natural light, and then a cozy family room with a stone fireplace and brown leather couches. I could think of way worse places to spend Thanksgiving, even if I was about to witness a familial apocalypse. After being greeted by Holly's parents, we were directed into the family room, and since we'd arrived a little earlier than everyone else, I got to enjoy some one-on-one time with her dad. He seemed like a pretty okay guy, a little stern, but a lot more laid back than I expected him to be. Holly had always made her dad out to be this kind of drill sergeant figure, a man who dedicated himself to building his company and who had very little time for anyone else. Holly had always made her dad out to be this kind of drill sergeant figure, a man who dedicated himself to building his company and who had very little time for anyone else. However, once he seemed happy that I wasn't a total douchebag intent on breaking his daughter's heart, he warmed up to me considerably. Holly and her mom brought through some hot apple cider, and we talked a little more before the rest of her relatives began to arrive. A few cousins showed up with aunts and uncles, and then one of her mom's old college friends showed up with her husband. Her grandpa was one of the last people to show up, and when he did, he felt the atmosphere immediately shift from joyful to mildly tense. Holly's grandpa seemed like a real grouchy guy, and I saw two of her aunts go into full-on people-pleasing mode in an attempt to manage the tension and avoid conflict. Grandpa seemed happy to see his daughters, but it was a lukewarm kind of happy. Holly's dad got a stern handshake and a very joyless, good to see you, son. But upon first glance, it didn't seem like he and Grandpa would be at each other's throats. I pointed this out to Holly and then mentioned how maybe that year might buck the trend in terms of family conflict. And she responded with a shake of her head and assured me that what I was seeing was most likely the calm before the storm. In her experience, the tension would inevitably ramp up throughout the course of the afternoon, and then add the return of the prodigal aunt into the mix, and she had a gut feeling that she'd be needing my support by early evening. And like I said, Holly's grandpa seemed stern, like father, like son, but unlike her dad, he didn't seem remotely interested in breaking the ice. When I was introduced as his granddaughter's boyfriend, he seemed completely disinterested and asked Holly's mom why I was there if I wasn't family. Then, when she tried to explain, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. It was obnoxious in the extreme, but I'd been warned of how much of an a-hole he could be, so it's not like I felt wounded when he treated me so rudely. Actually, it was kind of a relief. I didn't give a crap about what her weird old grandpa had to say. If my potential future mother and father-in-law were chill, then that was all I cared about. Holly's grandpa could go off, and sure, it'd be pretty unpleasant in the moment, but if things got a little too crazy, I'd be there to drive her home and make sure that she got the support that she needed. And after that, I was quite sure that the whole thing would be forgotten about in like a week, or maybe a month, or however long it took, and it'd be like it had never even happened in the first place. But when the incident did come, it wasn't some run-of-the-mill family yelling match. It was bigger, more frantic, and more frightening than anything I could have ever imagined. And so once I had the meeting with Holly's grouchy grandpa out of the way, I was feeling pretty good about the rest of the afternoon. He'd been making comments about me all day, about how I shouldn't have been there, about how they shouldn't be letting me date Holly, but literally everyone seemed chill except him, so it just became a case of staying out of his way and ignoring his jabs, and everything would go relatively smoothly. The only other real test the get-together had to endure was the arrival of Holly's Aunt Janet. Less than an hour before we all sat down for dinner, Aunt Janet arrived at Holly's parents' place. She was the oldest of her siblings, but looked pretty good for her age and showed up carrying what looked like some kind of portfolio bag, the kind artists use to transport their paintings from place to place. Aunt Janet and her siblings had talked while she was away, so it wasn't like it was their first time talking to her in 20 years, but it was still a profoundly emotional affair. There was a lot of hugging, a few tears, and Aunt Janet was even swapping greetings with her long-estranged father without incident. So even that late in the day, I was convinced that I dodged a major bullet and that everything might turn out all right. Janet and her sisters were sort of entrenched in catching up for about an hour while Holly's grandpa and some of the other guys watched football in pretty much next to silence, until finally, Holly's mom called us all to dinner. Holly was Italian on her mom's side, so in addition to most of the usual Thanksgiving stuff, there were things like shrimp cocktails, baked clams, and even a charcuterie board. Then instead of mashed potatoes or candied yams, her mom served baked ziti with her butter-basted turkey along with roasted Brussels sprouts and string beans sautéed in garlic and olive oil. And everything she put down on the table was absolutely incredible, and primarily most of the reason I remember most of it. And so much so that once everything was dolled out, the whole table quit talking for a solid 10 minutes and we just stuffed our faces until conversation slowly started up again. Everyone was focused on how good the food was, at least until after dinner when topics started to meander and Holly's father and aunt started to reminisce about their childhood. Aunt Janet stayed quiet for the most part, and then while Holly's mom started to clear the table after dessert had been served, Janet volunteered to help her. We talked amongst ourselves for a while, then once people started to try and get up from the table and do their own thing, Janet reappeared with that portfolio bag in her hand. She politely asked everyone to take a seat again because she wanted to host an after-dinner parlor game for us as a thank you for being such gracious hosts. Everyone seemed pretty excited. Then once we'd all returned to our seats, Janet announced that she'd liked everyone at the table to partake in a game of word association. She'd been gone for such a long time and, by her own admission, hadn't kept up to date with everyone nearly as much as she should have. So what better way to start the process of catching up than with a friendly, non-competitive game of word association? When Aunt Janet said parlor game, I figured that she just meant like charades or something. But when it came to word association, I didn't understand where the challenge actually was, and apparently neither did Holly's grandpa. He started up by asking something like, "The goddamn point of all of this?" but was quickly silenced by Holly's dad, who told him to be polite and allow Janet to host the game that she had planned. Everyone went quiet, and then Janet grabbed the large portfolio bag and revealed it to contain a portable whiteboard complete with legs to stand on. Now, these sort of expectant looks were exchanged on account of how well prepared she was, and at first, people were confused but excited. Then, after pulling out a marker from the whiteboard's carry bag, Aunt Janet began to write. The first word that she wrote on the whiteboard was school. Aunt Janet then went around the room asking for words or phrases people associated with school. My own personal answer was lunch, but she also got answers like teacher, homework, football team, and other things of that nature. Aunt Janet did the same thing with the word boathouse, then the word bear, and then finally she sort of surveyed all of our thought associations with the word truth. By the time she was done, Janet had written 4 big prompt words on the board along with dozens of smaller words leading off from the larger words, kind of like a mind map. She then put the cap back on the pen and then took a step back from the board and asked us all what we saw. Seeing as none of us could tell if her question was rhetorical or not, everyone stayed quiet and waited for the answer. And Janet wasted no time in telling us. She pointed to all the answers we'd given and told us that they were all kinds of answers that regular people give, whereas all her own answers were considerably different. Janet said that when she thought of the word school, she thought of the word sick, and that was due to all the sick days that she'd taken whilst in elementary school. I remember thinking, where's she going with this exactly? But then right after she said that last thing, Janet turned to Holly's grandpa and says, "You remember all those sick days too, don't you, Dad? But I was never really sick, was I? At least not for the most times you called the school and told them I was too sick to attend." There was this sort of discomfort across the dining table, and Holly's grandpa grumbled something about not knowing what she was talking about. But then Aunt Janet says, "Oh, you don't? You sure about that, Dad? You sure you got no idea what I'm talking about? Well, how's about this next word? Boathouse." Aunt Janet then said that whenever she saw or thought of the word boathouse, she didn't think of fishing trips or lakeside vacations. She thought of the pain she'd suffered one summer when she was a kid. She went on to describe how, when Holly's father was just a baby, the family had gone on a vacation in upstate New York. Janet had ended up misbehaving somehow, and Holly's grandpa had dragged her away from the lake and into a friend's boathouse for a stern talking to. But a stern talking to was not all she got. Janet claimed the punishment that she was given was a far cry from anything considered acceptable between father and daughter, and that the pain that she felt afterwards was so fierce that she couldn't sit down without her tummy hurting. Again, Holly's grandpa grumbled something about having no memory of the event, and everyone else stayed very quiet. Aunt Janet then pointed to the word bear, and then to a few of our more innocent associations. We'd said things like grizzly and teddy bear, and while Janet also associated the word with the small, stuffed, and cuddly variety, her further associations were not positive ones. Janet said that she associated teddy bears with distraction, delusion, even disassociation, because it was her teddies that her father told her to cuddle whenever he did things no father should ever be doing to their daughter. There was a straight-up gasp when she said that, and no one dared to get up from their chairs, and as Holly's grandpa began to yell about Janet being a crazy C-word, Janet shrieked over him so loud that everyone, including Grandpa, was silenced. That's when she pointed to the word truth. And although I definitely won't quote her verbatim because I'm quite confident it'll get your channel a strike or a warning or something of that nature, this is roughly what she said. Janet said that whenever she thought of the word truth, she felt that she'd been robbed of any positive association. Other people heard or read that word and it gave them hope for a sense of order and justice in the world. When she thought of the word truth, it was like a dagger in her gut. It hurt because for her whole life, she'd wondered if anyone would ever believe the truth of what her own father did to her when she was growing up. And even if she did one day find the courage to talk about it, she wondered how in the world a person goes about announcing something like that. Well, apparently, Janet had plenty of time to think about it. Then when she finally made up her mind and had the perfect method of delivery planned out, she called up Holly's dad and asked if she could attend Thanksgiving that year. And by the time Janet had finally finished her speech, people were either sobbing or just completely filled with shock. Then as she asked Holly's grandpa to say something, anything, he went from completely ashen and silent to filled with rage. He screamed at Janet, but Janet screamed right back at him. Holly's aunts were crying while her dad looked like he was on the verge of a mental breakdown. All of the people that weren't immediate family excused themselves and headed for the door the minute things started flying off the handle. I just remember reaching for Holly's hand and holding it. She looked like she was on the verge of catatonia, pale and wide-eyed, like her mind was struggling to compute what she had just heard. And I kept telling her, "We can leave if you want to," but she wouldn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on Janet and her grandpa, who suddenly rose from her chair and walked off toward the kitchen. Janet yelled something to him, and then when she appeared to run out of steam, she turned and walked towards her whiteboard and began packing it into its case, soundtracked by the sobbing of her sisters. It was probably one of the more surreal experiences of my entire life. Seeing the breakdown of a family like that would be emotionally intense at the very best of times. But to have such a sickening 30-year-old secret divulged like that was the kind of drama I've only ever seen in movies or TV. In those situations, people are glued to what they're seeing on screen. But then in real life, it's like I wanted the ground to just open up and swallow me so I didn't have to bear witness to any more mind-shattering heartbreak. I really did want nothing more than to get out of there, but there was no leaving without Holly. Wherever she went, I went, and for better or for worse. At first, it didn't look like Holly's grandpa was going to re-enter the dining room, and I don't think anyone had wanted him there either. I got the impression that with Holly's dad and aunts, the abuse of their elder sister and at the hands of their father was something they'd long suspected but never had confirmed. The shock only lasted a minute or two. What came next was this very deep, resounding grief, like they'd always known and had just never wanted to accept it. And after all, Holly's grandpa had barely said a word in his own defense, but then seconds later, he reappeared in the dining room's doorway with one hand held firmly behind his back. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see what Grandpa was concealing, but as he walked across the room and approached Aunt Janet, Holly's dad caught a glimpse of what he was holding and jumped from his chair. He yelled, "Dad, no!" and then threw himself across the room at him, just as Holly's grandpa raised a kitchen knife above his head. I don't think he'd have actually been able to stab Aunt Janet because she saw it coming way early and jumped back as Holly's dad grabbed Grandpa's arm. Grandpa was a man possessed. Like you could see it in his eyes that he'd completely lost his mind, but he was old and slow. While Holly's dad was still relatively fast but much, much stronger. And within seconds, Holly's dad had Grandpa restrained and Aunt Janet was walking out of the house while yelling assurances that no one would ever see her again. Not long after Janet left, and with Grandpa being sort of sequestered in another room, Holly decided it was finally time to leave. She stayed quiet the whole drive home, stayed in bed for almost a week afterwards, and ignored phone calls from just about everyone except me and a handful of her friends. She didn't want to talk about what had happened. In fact, we broke up long before I ever got the chance to really discuss things with her. or rather before there came a time when she was comfortable talking about it. And I don't blame her either. If that was me, I wouldn't even want to believe it, let alone be able to summon the strength to talk about it. And so despite seeing her family's breakdown up close, I never found out what happened in either the immediate or long-term aftermath. I still think about Holly quite often, even all these years later. I wonder how she's doing, and if her family ever found peace. I've sometimes thought about reaching out to her just to see how she's doing, but something tells me I'll only be a painful reminder of the single worst day of her life. The story I'm about to tell you is a mixture of my own recollection and the memories of others from this period. This incident happened back when I was a little girl, so I didn't fully understand what was happening with my parents until it was fully explained to me many years later. But I guess it's no good telling you half a story, so I'll just fill in the blanks where possible too. My mom and dad were never meant to be a couple, and those are my mom's words, not mine. I know that might sound like a pretty messed up thing to say to your own daughter, and it always comes with the caveat that I was the silver lining to all those dark clouds, but it's kind of the truth. From what I've been told, my dad was a psychotic habitual drug user, and since my mom was a teenage alcoholic who was incapable of making good decisions for herself, they ended up dating and mom wound up getting pregnant with me. They had a rocky relationship from the start, but after I was born, things got increasingly and then exponentially worse for them. Dad was still using drugs, so to give us some kind of household income, he started selling them too. And that took up pretty much all of his time, so he was away from home a lot, which left my teenage mom all alone to drink, smoke dope, and try to raise a child. She had to learn from hard experience, and she said for a while there, she was so terrified of how I'd grow up that she'd cry herself to sleep at night. But eventually she scaled back the amount that she was drinking, stopped using drugs altogether, and kinda sorta got the hang of being a mom. Cut to the time I'm 7 years old, and instead of some crummy run-down 2-bedroom apartment my dad is dealing drugs from, we're living in a crummy run-down 2-bedroom suburban in another part of the city. My dad's working a steady job, but only really as cover for his nightly activities, which by then was brokering drug deals between local sellers and buying from other cities in the tri-state area. He didn't keep anything at the house, but he was still heavily involved in the business, and although he made a ton of money doing it, almost all of it was used to finance his own personal vices. My mom wanted him to quit, but he wouldn't, and they'd fallen completely out of love by that point, so all they'd do was argue or snap at each other on the rare occasion Dad was ever home. Then toward the end of 1983, Mom said that she wanted us to try Thanksgiving dinner, like an actual one, and not just fried chicken takeout from someplace. Well, long story short, Mom messed up the food, Dad started yelling at her because he'd taken time out from his activities to be there with us, and then Mom ended up relapsing hard by guzzling both bottles of wine that she'd bought and kept untouched for Dad. And by the time she started to yell back at my father, slurring and wobbling as she did, I ran up to my room like I usually did to hide until the yelling had stopped. Sometime later, I'm not sure how much time passed, but I decided that I wanted to head downstairs to get some snacks. Dinner had obviously been canceled, and although the anxiety had kept my appetite at bay for a while, it wasn't long before it kicked in with a vengeance. With my stomach growling, I made my way downstairs, and to get to my kitchen, I had to walk through the little TV room. I opened up the door, fairly confident the fighting had subsided because it was all quiet there, but as I did, I started to hear Mom groaning in a weird way while Dad was saying something to her in hushed tones. I kept on pushing the door until I could see them both. Mom was laying on her side on the couch while Dad was kneeling next to her, looking like he was trying to push something into her mouth, like a small piece of food or a pill. But when he pushed it into her mouth, he took a glass of water and made Mom drink from it until she swallowed. She coughed a few times, but Dad made sure that she got it down and then went about pushing another little pill into Mom's mouth. He made her swallow that one with water too, but Then he did it over and over again before my stomach finally rumbled again and I was reminded of why I'd walked downstairs in the first place. And then I started walking through the TV room towards the kitchen. Mom and Dad used to do all kinds of weird stuff down there, so by age 7, I was kind of beyond questioning any of it. And most times when I walked through that room, my dad would either yell at me to get out or ignore me when he was too high to care. Only this time, when my dad noticed that I was walking through the room, he acted surprised, scared even, and then started explaining why he'd been giving Mommy pills. I told him all I wanted was to go get a snack because I was hungry, and then after he very uncharacteristically invited me to help myself to snacks and candy, he joined me in the kitchen and grabbed the biggest round-bottom cooking pan he could find, and then he went back into the room with it. As I walked back through with my snack and candy bars, Dad was supporting Mom as she leaned over and puked into the pan. He was rubbing her back and saying all kinds of very odd and nice things, but I remember how he stuck his fingers in her mouth at one point too. I thought it was maybe to get throw up out of her mouth because she didn't seem like she was fully awake. And now I know different. My dear old dad hadn't been trying to help my mom because she drank too much and made herself sick. He was trying to feed her so many pills that it would kill her. I don't know exactly what his plan was, and my mom doesn't know exactly what combination of pills he tried to give her either, but he certainly didn't plan on me walking in while it was happening. I guess he just tried to keep me calm and unquestioning at first, but when he realized that I might say something to the cops if I ever got questioned, he knew that he had to purge Mom's stomach of the pills before they took effect, and so that's what he did. Mom said she only realized what was happening because in the days after, it felt like she'd been swallowing broken glass. She went to take some pain meds for her very sore throat and then realized a bunch of medication bottles were missing. Dad played dumb and said that he didn't know what she was talking about, but he'd also failed to properly clean the carpet of Mom's vomit. She said that she kneeled down to sniff a patch of carpet just to make sure it wasn't her nose playing tricks on her, and that's when she saw a little white pill sitting under the couch. She'd obviously coughed or spat it out while Dad was force-feeding them to her. Then, in the rush to void her stomach, someone had knocked it under the couch. She was then able to figure out which kind of medication it was and then confronted my dad on where the rest of it had disappeared to. He then gave her some big sob story about how she'd done it to herself and that he'd been the one to save her. But Mom had long since figured out when Dad was lying to her and when he was telling the truth. She left not long after, with me in tow, which I guess is what Dad wanted, to get rid of us, but it was obviously reaching dangerously critical levels of wanting that to happen. If he was willing to hurt Mom, what would he have done with me? Would he have left me on the doorstep of an orphanage with a sign around my neck? Or would I have been the next one to have myself a little accident? A few years back, I drove over to my parents' place to spend Thanksgiving with them and our extended family. As I stepped out of my car, I remember smelling the smoke of burning log fires drifting on the breeze, and it was like stepping through a time machine. I don't know about you, but there's something really special about that time of year when all the different smells and sensations of late fall can take you right back to being a kid again. But I wasn't a kid anymore, far from it in fact. I had taken my place as the unmarried uncle, showing up halfway through the day after spending the morning at work. The driveway of my parents' house was lined with cars, and as I walked towards the front door, I could already hear the swirls of conversation and laughter coming from inside. After knocking on the door, my mom appeared on the entrance, and as she welcomed me inside, a wave of warmth and rich aromas hit my face. The combined scent of roast turkey and spiced pies and something unmistakably buttery hung thick in the air. And then as Mom pulled me in for a big hug, I truly felt at home. After we swapped a little small talk regarding the weather and the drive over, Mom walked me into a living room alive with activity and then announced my arrival. My cousins were sprawled across the couches, looking away from their football game for just the briefest of moments to greet me with raised beer bottles. A few of the kids were sitting on the floor between them, holding plates of snacks and chattering amongst themselves, and it was amazing to see how much they've grown. In the kitchen, a few of my aunts and uncles sat around the dinner table sipping glasses of wine. Even more children darted in and out as my mom made her way to the stove, joined by an aunt who started stirring and tasting and then passing notes back to Mom. It was loud, messy, and in my mind, perfect. It felt like Thanksgiving, and it felt like home. I asked my mom if that was everyone, as in everyone who was due to show up for dinner, and she said that we were only waiting on one other person to show up, and that person was Uncle Tony. My Uncle Tony was still considered the baby among his siblings and was only around 10 years older than myself at the time, so early 40s. He was a pretty unremarkable guy, close to my grandpa but quiet and mostly kept to himself. I lived out of town, but Uncle Tony lived out of state, so every family holiday, he'd make the 4-hour drive across state lines and was usually the last to join us. Personally, I was always figured that he deliberately timed his journey to coincide with dinner being less than an hour from the table. He was never a particularly outgoing person, so I figured all the small talk and catching up with distant relatives was a bit of a headache for him. He'd show up before dinner, eat his fill, and then relax with us for a few hours while everyone was too full of turkey to say anything to each other. But then that year, it looked like he was cutting things a little too close for comfort. About a half hour before Mom was set to ring the dinner bell, she asked me to text Uncle Tony for his estimated time of arrival, and I figured he'd be driving, so I didn't expect his immediate response, but when dinner was only around 5 minutes from the table, Mom asked me to give him a call to check where he was. I called once, but it went to voicemail. I then called a second time, but it didn't ring as long as before the call went to his answering machine, and I figured that was a sign of life since him declining the call meant that he was probably only a few blocks away. He also wouldn't want to risk a ticket by, talking on the wheel or something on a day when the cops are pretty much just dying to bag themselves a few drunks or bad drivers to make holiday examples out of. I told all that to my mom, but she was still very concerned, so she had me calling my Uncle Tony on repeat while she got everyone to the table. She then asked me to sort of help deal with dishes and serving plates to everyone at the table, but once we'd all sat down to eat, she kept checking her phone and complaining that Tony wasn't responding to messages. All the adults who knew him checked their phones just in case he sent somebody a message that they hadn't seen yet. But when they didn't see any notifications from him, they just began consuming their food. And no one seemed all that worried about Tony at first, but it wasn't because they didn't care. He was always the last to show up and did so by that small margin that I talked about earlier, so they figured that he'd just run into a little bit of traffic or something and would be there within the hour. And so by the time we'd all finished our bowls of pumpkin pie and hand-whipped vanilla cream and all that good stuff, Uncle Tony still hadn't shown up, and neither had he called or texted to let us know where he was. A few of us started calling and texting him again, only this time with very added concern. It was my phone that his name first flashed across, as it buzzed with an incoming text message notification, but despite what I read being totally innocuous, it was somehow oddly unsettling too. Uncle Tony had texted me, but all his message read was, "Hi." It's hard to articulate what I felt in the moments that followed. Getting that single word message was so out of character that I think I instinctively knew something was wrong with Uncle Tony from the moment I read it. However, as I tried to figure out how to properly convey my concern, I stayed quiet, just long enough to hear the phones of my relatives begin to buzz with their own incoming messages. They came in at a rate of about one every 10 to 15 seconds, but one by one, my aunts, uncles, mother, and father all got single-word messages that simply read, "Hi." It was one of my uncles that got the first message as he read it out loud for everyone to hear. There were a few moments of confusion as people wondered why he might send such a very weird message when he was almost 90 minutes late for dinner. And then right as the concern started to register on their faces, my mom tapped her phone, put it to her ear, and waited for my Uncle Tony to answer her call. When he once again failed to pick up, we all started sending him messages mostly along the lines of "Are you okay? Pick up the phone. Call us when you can." I was the first to receive a reply. "Hope I haven't left you all waiting, lol," it read. It was completely inconsistent with Uncle Tony's usual style of texting, and knowing the person on the other end wouldn't answer any calls, I found myself texting, "Who is this?" The reply came in seconds and simply read, "Thumbelina." Knowing I probably wasn't going to get anything useful out of them, I decided to ask one more question before calling the cops. I texted, "Where's Tony?" Then when the reply came, I had to struggle to keep a straight face as I got up from the table. I told everyone I was going to call a friend of his just in case he passed out drunk and they were texting from his phone as a prank or something. It was a dumb excuse. Everyone knew that wasn't like Uncle Tony to get blackout drunk like that, and had appropriately confused expressions as I got up from the table and walked into the kitchen. But honestly, I couldn't think of anything else to say. All my brainpower was focused on maintaining this complete poker face, not freaking the heck out, because in response to my messages of "Where's Tony?" whoever had this phone had texted me back, "I don't know, but there will be no more Thanksgivings where he's going, ha 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 ha." The first thing I did when I walked into the kitchen was call the cops. One of my uncles followed and soon figured out that I wasn't talking to Uncle Tony's friend. We tried to keep the news from spreading, but the rest of the adults soon figured out something was wrong when whoever had Tony's phone started texting them similarly creepy stuff. After that, the mood in the house began to sharply decline, but everyone managed to keep from totally panicking or displaying too much of any other emotion, at least until all the kids were either upstairs or on their way home from their parents. And after that, all bets were off, and my mom and aunt were fanning themselves in between bouts of sobbing, praying this whole thing was just some sick joke. But sadly, it wasn't. By the time I placed the 911 call in my mom's kitchen, the cops had already found my Uncle Tony. He was sitting in his car, which was parked in the parking lot of a closed-up business, and he was leaned up against the steering wheel with a bullet hole through his head. They found his phone just a few hours later, in the hands of a girl sitting in a diner only a few miles from where Tony's car was found. She'd cut off his thumb so she could keep unlocking his phone every time she wanted to use it, and although she could have used it to do just about anything, she chose to taunt the relatives of the man she just shot through the head on the way to a family Thanksgiving. And from what I understand, the whole thing was a pretty open and shut case. The girl was so crazy that when the cops arrived to arrest her, she insisted on finishing off a text message before they put her in cuffs. She didn't get to send it, but she was in the process of typing out a message to one of Tony's coworkers, gloating about how he'd never get to see him again. I think she spent about 5 minutes with psychiatrists before they declared the girl to be completely and utterly out of her mind. She was detained at the hospital and has been there ever since. The cops later said that they figured that she was some type of hitchhiker, and since she was young, small of stature, and generally disarming in appearance, Uncle Tony had most likely offered to give her a ride someplace. But that is something that never, ever sat right with us. Like I said earlier, Tony was a very reserved kind of guy, possibly to the point that you might call him selfish. There's no way he'd have stopped to give anyone a ride. Not unless they were in serious, life-or-death kind of trouble. He'd rather forego the human interaction, and Mom said he was like that since pretty much forever. So we've all kind of wondered just what happened for him to pull over and let that girl into his car, because it wouldn't be like any Uncle Tony we knew to put himself at risk like that, not unless something was very, very wrong. Born on September 21st of 1940, Lowell Lee Andrews' hometown newspaper once described him as the nicest boy in Wolcott, Kansas. Founded in the mid-19th century, Wolcott was named for the railroad official who lobbied for an extension of the Missouri Pacific Railroad into the area. This allowed it to become closely linked with nearby Kansas City, and ever since, it's been considered a sleepy attachment to the city's bustling urban sprawl. It's here that young Lowell Andrews grew up, and back in the 50s, Wolcott was still a small, mostly rural portion of Wyandotte County. It was surrounded by farmland and orchards, and despite the construction of a nearby highway, the town was reluctant to urbanize in the same way as other suburbs had. It was a quiet, quaint, and wholesome little town, where young Lowell's intellect and music talents were allowed to flourish. He was a passionate reader, played bassoon in the college band, and by the late fall of 1958, an 18-year-old Lowell had enrolled at a local college to study biology. But despite outward appearances, Lowell did not enjoy his life in Wolcott and was firmly convinced his future lay elsewhere. During late November of 1958, Lowell and his older sister had both returned home to spend Thanksgiving weekend with their parents. 20-year-old Jenny was enrolled at the University of Kansas, where she was studying to become a teacher, and on the evening of Friday, November 28th, she lay on the couch watching TV with her parents after a dinner of leftover turkey. Lowell, on the other hand, chose not to join them, and instead sat upstairs in his bedroom reading the final novel of seminal Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky, entitled The Brothers Karamazov. Set in 19th century Russia, The Brothers Karamazov is a passionate philosophical novel that discusses questions of God, free will, and mortality. It has also been described as a theological drama dealing with problems of faith, doubt, and reason in the context of a modernizing Russia, with a plot that revolves around the subject of patricide. After reaching the novel's conclusion, Lowell is believed to have closed it, placed it down on the desk in front of him, and remained in silent thought for a prolonged period of time. Lowell then walked into the bathroom, lathered up his face, and shaved using his father's safety razor. He did so with precision and care, ensuring that there was no errant whiskers or accidental cuts. Then once completed, Lowell walked back to his bedroom and put on the black two-piece suit his parents had purchased him following his college acceptance. Lowell stopped for a moment to inspect himself in a hallway mirror, ensuring that his hair and attire were nothing short of immaculate. And then, after opening a closet in his bedroom, Lowell retrieved a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle and began walking downstairs. There in the Andrews family's living room, his parents and older sister had their eyes fixed on the TV. They heard Lowell's footsteps in the doorway but didn't turn to look. Since they were watching a movie, and in order to replicate the magic of the movie theater, the Andrews family had turned out their living room lights. When Lowell flicked them on, they vocally protested, but as his mother, father, and sister turned to look at him, looks of terror filled their eyes. Lowell hadn't turned on the lights to ruin their movie experience. He turned them on in order to better aim his rifle. The first of Lowell's bullets punched through the skull of his older sister, killing her instantly. Sprawled out on the couch and in direct view of Lowell as he walked into the living room, she presented the easiest and most obvious target. Lowell's parents, on the other hand, died much, much harder. Lowell put 3 quick bullets into his 50-year-old father, William, and then did the same to his 42-year-old mother, Opal Andrews, as she tried to shield her husband's body. Lowell took a moment to calm himself before beginning the next phase of his plan, and approached a living room window before hearing movement coming from behind him. He returned to find that somehow his mother had survived her injuries, and after staggering to her feet, she lunged at him. In little more than a second, Lowell Andrews put 3 more bullets into the woman that had raised him. She fell to the floor, took her final breaths, and then passed away. Lowell stared at her lifeless body for a moment, regarding his murdered mother with a chilling lack of emotion. Seconds later, he heard more movement behind him. Lowell turned, only to see his bleeding father crawling towards the kitchen telephone. He took aim, sending multiple .22 caliber bullets into his father until his ammunition ran dry. He then took out a Ruger .22 caliber pistol from his hip holster and emptied all of its bullets into his father's back. It was a brutally cold-hearted execution, but Lowell wasn't done there. When his pistol quit firing, he ejected the empty clip, loaded a fresh one, then began shooting into his father's lifeless body almost at random. A homicide detective later said that it was as if Lowell had wanted to observe the damage his shots inflicted to different parts of his father's body, a sickening experiment performed on the man who raised him. Lowell fired a total of 6 shots at his mother, but 17 at his father. Then, when all was said and done, he began staging the scene to make it appear as if a household burglary had somehow gone horribly wrong. He opened a window in the family living room, then stacked garden furniture outside it, intent on giving the impression that someone had climbed through the window while the family were dozing. Police were meant to assume that an outnumbered home invader had panicked upon waking the family, and in the ensuing chaos had murdered them one by one. Lowell then drove over to his apartment in the nearby town of Lawrence, Kansas, where he began to establish his alibi. Having lent a friend his precious typewriter, he arranged to pick it up that evening under the pretense that he had to write an essay. Then, after dropping the typewriter off at his apartment, Lowell visited a local movie theater where he attended a showing of the 1958 movie Mardi Gras. He spoke loudly, imparted friendly greetings to other theatergoers, and placed himself in the very rear of the theater so that everyone filing out at its conclusion would see him seated quite prominently at the back of a well-lit theater. Once the movie was over, Lowell decided to drive to the banks of the Kansas River, where he dismantled the weapons used to murder his family and tossed the separate parts off the Massachusetts Street Bridge. He then returned to his apartment, telephoned local law enforcement, and informed them that he strongly suspected his parents' house had just been burgled. However, when the police arrived at his apartment and were forced to pass on the bad news of his family's murder, they observed that Lowell expressed only the slightest amount of surprise. Yet not only did Lowell seem unperturbed at what would normally be considered devastating news, there was barely a hint of emotion about him. When asked how he knew of the potential break-in at his parents' home, Lowell began obfuscating. Then once he admitted his 911 call was prompted by what he called a bad feeling, he was promptly arrested as the case's primary suspect. Whilst in police custody, Lowell vehemently protested his innocence. He claimed that he had a falling out with his parents prior to Thanksgiving and hadn't been over to their place in weeks. But the fact that Lowell seemed to have had a mysterious premonition regarding the incident which led to his parents' and sister's deaths was extremely incriminating. Homicide detectives pressed him for hours, demanding to know why and how Lowell had killed his family. It took the intervention of the family's minister, a pastor Vertio C. Dameron, to finally coerce a confession from who he'd once considered a promising young man. Dameron reportedly gave the boy a Coke before asking him, "You didn't do this terrible thing, did you? If you did, now's the time to purge your soul." Lowell might have finally admitted to the murder of his mother, father, and sister, but the confession was completely devoid of remorse. Lowell told police officers, "I'm not sorry, but I'm not glad I did it either. I just don't know why I did it. I didn't even feel anything as they died." At his trial, the defense argued that Pastor Dameron's testimony of Lowell's confession should be stricken from the record. They further explained that Pastor Dameron, quote, occupied the role of minister of the church of which the defendant was a member, essentially claiming the relationship had unspoken confidentiality, similar to that which exists between a doctor and a patient. But as Pastor Dameron himself asserted, there was no course of discipline in the Baptist church by which a member thereof was enjoined to confess his sins to a minister of the church. On the advice of his defense team, Lowell pled not guilty to reason of insanity and was subsequently sent for tests at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. It was here that Dr. Joseph Satin established that Andrews was almost certainly schizophrenic, but that he had been completely compos mentis, or of composed mind, at the time that he murdered his family. Dr. Satin went on to call Andrews' crime a sudden murder, meaning his behavior had been perfectly regular both before and after his family's slaughter. This led the doctor to believe the state was well within its right to prosecute Lal to the full extent of the law, and which they promptly did. After taking the stand, Lal's pleas of insanity fell on deaf ears, and following his conviction, he was condemned to be executed. After his request for clemency was denied by the state's governor, Lal was asked about his family's funeral arrangements. "I don't care what you do with them," he said. Then, when asked if he had any regrets regarding the murders, he stated, "I didn't feel anything about it. The time came and I was doing what I had to do. That's all there was to it." After further appeals for clemency were disregarded by the U.S. Supreme Court, Lal Lee Andrews was executed by hanging on November 30th of 1962, aged just 22. His last meal consisted of 2 fried chickens with sides of mashed potatoes, green beans, and pie a la mode, and he gave no last words. Those in attendance gave eerie accounts of Lal's final moments, with one reporter stating he was, and I quote, "outwardly remorseless and disinterested." Another reporter, this one from the Associated Press, said Lal was actually smiling slightly as he was led to the gallows. Because Lal was a hefty 6'1" and 250 pounds, it's believed that he had to hang for some time before he was pronounced dead. Other witnesses claimed the rope actually broke, but despite their proliferation, such rumors were never confirmed. Lal Andrews was one of the last people to be executed in the state of Kansas. He was subsequently buried next to his parents and sister in the Mount Salem Cemetery in Excello, Missouri. The 3 family members were labeled on a single tombstone. Lal's separate tombstone lies parallel and is engraved with a single word, son. Prior to his execution, Lal was detained at the Lansing Correctional Facility, the very same place as the murders of the Clutter family were being held, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. Hickok and Smith had been made infamous following the release of Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood, with the former being asked what he thought of Lal Andrews following numerous daily interactions with him. "He was a funny kid," Hickok said. "He had no respect for human life, not even his own." Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered from members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I forget.